and welcome to Edinburgh Skeptics on the Science Festival. Welcome to the third of our series of talks about sex. Our talk for Thursday, our fourth and final talk, unfortunately we've had to make some rearrangements and had a cancellation. So what we've done as a substitute is, early on in lockdown last year, we had a fabulous regular speaker, Chase C. Gillespie, come and talk to us about Goop. And as Gwyneth Paltrow seems to have an unhealthy obsession with putting things up your vagina, it seemed vaguely relevant to what we've been talking about the last few of our events that we've had over the Science Festival. So we thought that would be an appropriate thing to replay. So we'll be playing that on Thursday. So if you didn't catch that then, or you just hearing about it now for the first time and fancy hearing about all the weird things that Gwyneth Paltrow thinks you should put up your foo-foo, come and join us on Thursday. And obviously over the next few days, you've still got plenty of more things that you can catch at the Science Festival. Don't forget to check their website for events that they've still got going on. I think most of those are online at the moment. And don't forget to follow us at Edinburgh Skeptics on our social media. We're on Twitter and Facebook, and you can send us questions via those if you want to tonight for the talk, if you don't want to put them in the YouTube chat. But most questions, if you can put them in the YouTube chat, it'll help us collate them, and we should have 10 or 15 minutes at the end to put them to Gayle. So our talk tonight is going to be given by Dr. Gayle Brewer. She is a senior lecturer at the University of Liverpool. Her research focuses on individual differences on sexual behaviour, with particular emphasis on sexual conflict, harassment and coercion. And she has published over 80 journal articles and a range of books and book chapters. And her talk is on the Dark Triad, the narcissism and other things which lead to unhealthy sexual behaviours. So I'm going to hand over to Gayle now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Heather. So as has just been mentioned in the introduction, I'm going to be looking at how the Dark Triad traits relate to our sexual behaviour and attractiveness. And I am going to focus more on the more aggressive sexual behaviours such as harassment and coercion. So please bear that in mind if any of those content would be upsetting to you. So to define what I mean by the Dark Triad traits, essentially these are three interrelated but distinct personality traits, and they share a common core of emotional coldness, a willingness to exploit others, and a lack of empathy. So that's the shared common core of these personality traits. And the distinct elements for narcissism relate to feelings of superiority, a sense of entitlement, and really feeling that you are better than everybody else and being very confident in your abilities and attractiveness. Machiavellianism is characterised by people being more manipulative, seeing people as a means to an ends, having a lack of faith in humanity, and so being quite cynical and unwilling to trust people, but being quite flexible in your approach. So those high on Machiavellianism are more likely to engage in cooperation if that will achieve their end result, but they will also engage in conflict if they think that that will be beneficial to them as well. And then lastly, psychopathy is characterised by an emotional coldness, being very much self-centred and antisocial or aggressive behaviour. And often the research has focused on psychopathy as a whole. Other researchers have differentiated between primary psychopathy and secondary psychopathy. Sometimes in the literature, that's also called factor 1 and factor 2 forms of psychopathy. And the primary form here really relates to, if you imagine the kind of Gordon Gekko boss type character, where somebody is very emotionally detached. They're quite happy to engage in immoral behaviour, deception, so that they can be successful. Whereas secondary psychopathy is more likely to be associated with a very perhaps physically aggressive, risky and impulsive behaviour. So those are the individuals who are more likely to be high sensation seeking and maybe get into a bar fight and those sorts of things. I do want to emphasize that I am talking about these dark triad traits as personality traits. So they are personality traits that all of us have to a greater or lesser degree, in the same way as we might display confidence or extroversion. I'm not talking about clinical disorders here or trying to categorize people. And it's customary when people are talking about the dark triad traits to perhaps try to sum up, the idea of a person who is high perhaps on these dark triad traits. And I thought it was really difficult to come up with one person who could perhaps epitomize the traits of narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. So I will just add this picture of a cat here, and you can use your own imagination as to whether any individual springs to mind. So in terms of relating these dark triad traits to attraction and sexual behaviour, first of all, we can think about whether people who are high on these dark triad traits are more attractive to other individuals or not. And I mean purely here in a physical attractiveness sense. And so we start here with some research conducted by Holtzman a decade ago. And they were looking at facial appearance and the dark triad traits. And they started by obtaining both the individual self-reports of people of their dark triad traits and peer reports, their friends. And so they decided who was high and low in these three dark triad traits, and then they created facial morphs. So essentially you have a number of people who are high in the trait and morph their face together, and then you do the same for people who are low in that trait. And because you're using an average, a composite of these faces, that's why the images that you can see on the top right there are quite similar to each other, because you've got lots of faces that are morphed together. So you're not just picking individuals and saying this person is high on that trait. So they created these prototype morph faces. So you've got people who are high and low in each of the dark triad traits. And then they presented them to people and asked them if they could pick out the people who displayed certain characteristics. And they used these descriptions. So for narcissism, they said, okay, this is a person who is arrogant and pompous and self-absorbed. For Machiavellianism, they described a person who is manipulative and scheming. And for somebody high on psychopathy, they referred to somebody who was reckless and assertive with other people and quite antagonistic. And the results showed that people, at least better than chance, were able to identify the morph that had the high level of these traits, which suggests that perhaps there is some sort of physical cue to these personality traits, as there are for other personality traits as well. And I'm certainly not suggesting that we can look at one person and decide exactly what their personality is, but we are better than chance at picking out these sorts of cues. So that brings me on then to attractiveness. So if there's something that we can detect in somebody's facial appearance that gives away these traits, do we find those attractive or not? So in one study that we did a few years ago now, we essentially invited people into the lab, or invited women into the lab, and showed them faces. And we found that overall, women did not find the faces that were high on narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy to be attractive. And they also thought that those high dark triad trait faces were more dangerous. So they perceived them to be more threatening. As we all know, or perhaps if we maybe think back to about 2 years ago now, when we used to go out, we remember that sometimes, though, our perception of people and our ability to make good social decisions is sometimes compromised. So as well as looking at their overall perceptions of these faces, we also looked at whether alcohol consumption would impact on their perceived attractiveness. Essentially, if you have consumed alcohol rather than the control lemonade or a placebo that they thought might be alcoholic, are they more likely to find these high threat faces attractive? But we didn't find that the alcohol consumption impacted on the way that they viewed these faces, either in terms of attractiveness or perceived dangerousness. We obviously don't just look at people, perhaps when we're looking at potential partners in terms of physical attractiveness, though. Clearly, we also take into account their behaviour, perhaps how they relate to other people, all sorts of personality qualities and their lifestyle choices, etc. So other research has focused less on the physical features associated with dark triad traits, and they have looked at the behaviours and the characteristics associated with the dark triad instead. So in one study, researchers created these dating advertising profiles based on the dark triad traits. So perhaps identifying somebody as quite ambitious and emotionally distant and those sorts of things that we've already discussed. And they found that women were more likely to be attracted to people or to men that were high on these traits than those who were low on them. Particularly younger women who were perhaps less likely to be entering into a long-term relationship. But that is important. What kind of relationship are you looking for? Because the kinds of traits that you look for in a long-term partner who you might want to raise children with might be slightly different than somebody who you just want to spend the weekend with because you're out of lockdown and you really miss spending time with people. So in another study, Aitken et al. Looked at these dating adverts, and these were written by men who were high or low in Machiavellianism. And they found that the men who were low on Machiavellianism were more attractive as the long-term partners, so the serious committed relationship. But those who were high on Machiavellianism were more attractive as these short-term mates. And those ones who were high on Machiavellianism, attractive as a short-term partner, were seen as potentially, again, more likely to be dangerous, more likely to deceive the person in terms of how committed they were to the relationship. And certainly within the research, this distinction between the short-term relationship and the long-term committed relationship is a common theme of the dark triad research. So often when we're looking at this kind of dark triad research, the findings have focused on the types of relationship that people are interested in. They're looking at the type of partner that people are attracted to. And overall, the suggestion is that particularly men who are high on dark triad traits are more likely to be attracted high on dark triad traits are more likely to be attracted to short-term relationships, so casual sex, for example, rather than a long-term committed relationship with one partner. And partly reflecting that research, people have often drawn from the dark triad literature that dark triad traits are perhaps a male sexual strategy. that they are something which particularly influences male behaviour, and that dark triad traits are more important for short-term relationships than for long-term serious committed relationships. And I must admit that as both a researcher and a female, I don't necessarily hold with some of those conclusions. My personal take would be that girls are not all sugar and spice, and they also display these dark triad traits on a spectrum, with some people very high on them, some people very low. And dark triad traits also are going to be influential when we look at their behaviour, and their behaviour in both short-term relationships and these long-term committed relationships. So the research that I have generally conducted, and I should say here that my research is collaborative. I work with some excellent researchers, particularly Minna Lyons and Luna Centofanti. I've worked with a lot. So this research really reflects that collaboration rather than just work that I've been doing myself. So the work that we've been doing has often focused on dark triad traits in relation to women's behaviour and in relation to these long-term committed romantic relationships, rather than just the sort of briefer casual sex type relationships. So in a series of studies, one of the things that we looked at was how attached we are to our romantic partners. So often one of the things that we're familiar with talking about is how closely we are attached to loved ones, whether it be a family member or a friend or a romantic partner. But of course, people vary in the strength and the quality of that attachment. So we looked at two different less secure aspects of attachment here. We looked at attachment anxiety, and attachment anxiety occurs where people are perhaps more likely to overestimate the threats posed to their relationship. So you might think that somebody else is about to steal your partner, for example, and stronger reactions to perceived rejection. So you don't accept that somebody is just busy for the evening. You think it's a sign that they really don't like you and don't want to spend time with you. The second aspect of attachment that we looked at was avoidance. And those who are high in attachment avoidance tend to feel quite uncomfortable when they are dependent on others, and they tend to dislike emotional intimacy. So you might predict that these sorts of attachment issues would be more likely in those high on the dark triad traits, where they are more likely to show this kind of emotional coldness and a lack of faith in others, etc. So in this study of women, and most of the research that I've conducted in this area has been based on these self-report questionnaire studies. Some of the work has obviously been experimental or observational, but certainly when it comes to asking about people's relationships, then for ethical and practical reasons, questionnaires are more appropriate. So the women that we recruited, we found that those high on Machiavellianism and both the primary and secondary psychopathy tended to be more avoidant. And that fits really with the notion of these individuals being more emotionally cold. So those high on Machiavellianism, looking at other individuals as a means to an end, being willing to exploit them, and thinking, I will exploit you before you exploit me. And of course, primary and secondary psychopathy, where there's that kind of risky behaviour and a lack of emotional attachment. And also women who were high in secondary psychopathy and low on narcissism were more anxious. about their relationships. And again, that makes sense that those who are less narcissistic would be more worried about their relationship, or perhaps those who are, feel very superior and confident are not worried that their partner is perhaps going to leave them or reject them in some way. So that was one aspect of the research. But we also looked at relationship conflict, because an important part of relationship is not necessarily the hearts and flowers when everything is going wonderfully, but how we deal with perceived threats to our relationship. So how we negotiate that with our partner, and whether we deal with those sorts of issues in a positive, constructive, or negative, destructive way. So here we looked at, again, women and the Dark Triad, and we looked at 4 different aspects of conflict resolution. So we looked at what's termed exit, and that's the active destructive behavior. So that's where somebody might, for example, be causing an argument or something which is causing damage to the relationship. We looked at voice, where somebody is being active and constructive. And here, of course, they might be saying that they want to talk about the relationship. The dreaded, we need to talk and sit down and work through some things. Loyalty, which is passive, but constructive. So somebody might be thinking, oh, I'll just wait and things will get better. I'm not going to take it personally what the partner has said. I still believe in our relationship and want to make it work. And of course, the passive destructive version, neglect, where somebody might decide that they are just going to let the relationship kind of go to the dogs, and they're not going to try to maintain it. So in terms of the Dark Triad traits, those who were high in Machiavellianism were less likely to engage in a kind of response to the conflict that they experienced. So they were less likely to use an active destructive behavior, but also they were less likely to use active or passive constructive behavior. So these individuals who were had a kind of lack of faith in other individuals, are quite cynical, think other people will get them before they are able to exploit their partner. They were not as interested in maintaining the relationship. For those high on primary psychopathy, they were more likely to engage in destructive behavior, as you might expect from that emotional callousness. And that was both in terms of active and passive destructive behavior. And those who are high in secondary psychopathy, so that quite impulsive, risky behavior, were more likely to engage in the active, constructive behavior, actually. They were more likely to say, right, okay, let's talk about this, and kind of jump in perhaps 2 feet first without thinking about the consequences of where that might go. And another aspect to that particular study was looking at controlling behavior. So often when we think about partner violence, we're thinking about physical forms of abuse. But of course, the psychological or emotional abuse and controlling behavior is also incredibly distressing and harmful for people in those relationships. So we looked at the Dark Triad in relation to 3 different elements of controlling behavior specific to that romantic relationship. So we looked at whether people were monitoring their partner's behavior, so using surveillance and threatening them, the extent to which they try to control their everyday behavior and routines, and control over their independence, their autonomous behavior. And generally here, it was the secondary psychopathy that seemed to be most important for women. So of course, here we're talking about women and the controlling behaviour that they display towards their partner, rather than being the victim of that behaviour. And so those high on the secondary psychopathy were more likely to engage in all forms of these controlling behaviours. And in addition, those who were high in Machiavellianism and primary psychopathy were more likely to try to control autonomous behaviour, perhaps because those high in Machiavellianism are concerned that they are going to be manipulated themselves, and so they are trying to reduce the level of damage that they might experience, but obviously follow-up work is needed there. In terms of other forms of negative relationship type behaviours, one which is a common form of negative behaviour is that of using deception within relationships. And certainly there are many types of deception, and I'll get on to the infidelity research in a moment. But certainly there tends to be a lot of deception related specifically to sexual behaviour. So that might be, as I've included here, lying in order to try to coerce your partner into sexual behaviour. It might be, trying to avoid confrontation. It might be lying about, for example, the number of previous sexual partners. And there's a lot of literature showing the extent to which people will try to deceive partners or potential partners about this kind of content. And of course, that has important ramifications for things like, health and well-being, if people are lying about their sexual history or other factors like their use of contraceptives. So we looked here at these 3 different types of sexual deception. And so those who were high in narcissism and high in Machiavellianism were more likely to engage in the kind of blatant forms of lying. And that makes sense when we think about those high in narcissism being, very confident in their abilities. Perhaps they don't think that other people will be able to detect their deception, or they're not worried, perhaps, about somebody finding out that they're lying because they're so attractive that, of course, their partner will still want to be with them. And of course, Machiavellianism, engaging in that kind of manipulative behavior, that's also ties in with the blatant lying. So the high primary and high secondary psychopathy, that was associated with the self-serving deception. And those high in Machiavellianism were more likely to engage in deception in order to avoid confrontation. And I think that points to one of the interesting features about Machiavellianism is that they're not necessarily trying to cause distress to another individual. When those high in Machiavellianism are using manipulation or they're using exploitation, they're doing so for a purpose, to get a certain end result. They're not doing it because they like to see somebody in distress per se. So by using this kind of form of lying, they might be trying to still avoid confrontation, which might have a negative result for them, and still keep somebody on side so that they can perhaps manipulate them later on in the future. And then infidelity, obviously one of the core areas of sexual deception, and something, if you look at the literature at least, without wishing to be pessimistic, is certainly a frequently experienced behaviour, both when people are in committed relationships like marriage and also at the earlier stages of relationships. And there's been quite a lot of research which has looked, for example, at personality traits such as the Dark Triad, and how that relates to infidelity. So we looked here at women's actual incidence of infidelity, and obviously they are self-reporting that to us. And those who are high in narcissism, so who feel quite superior, they are the ones that say that they have been unfaithful in the past. But we also wondered about, whether somebody would be interested in infidelity, so to speak, because whether you actually engage in infidelity is not just a reflection of your openness to be unfaithful. It's also a reflection of whether you can attract a partner to be unfaithful with you. So we also looked at this intentions to engage in infidelity. And it might seem strange to ask people, or that might seem strange that people do report that they would be quite happy to have an affair if the opportunity arose. But certainly people were quite open in this. And again, those who were high in narcissism, so see themselves as very attractive, superior to others, and have a sense of entitlement, unsurprisingly, they are more likely to say that they would have an affair if the opportunity arose. And also those who are high in that secondary psychopathy. So individuals who are sensation seeking, who engage in risky behaviour, again, they are more likely to be happy to engage in that kind of activity. And of course, one issue with a lot of this research is that though it's grounded in evolutionary psychology and we're looking at sexual behavior in terms of that overarching evolutionary structure, we don't necessarily know about the evolutionary consequences of these dark triad traits in terms of the actual reproductive outcomes, so to speak. So we know that in many species, including humans, personality relates to things like the number of children that people might have. So in other species, we find traits such as boldness and aggression are related to reproductive success. There's been a real lack of research looking at the dark triad and actual reproductive outcomes. When we started this research, we found a couple of papers that had started to look at reproductive outcomes rather than attractiveness or sexual behavior. But these were quite niche populations. So in this first Medvedevich paper, they looked at one facet of psychopathy, which did relate to having fewer children, and one which related to having a higher number of children, but in a very specialist population of male prisoners in Serbia. And in the Val et al. Study, they didn't find a relationship between the number of children that somebody had and psychopathy-like traits, but again, a very niche population of personality disorder outpatients. So we looked at this in a larger population, a general population, and basically tried to look at the number of children that people were reporting, controlling for things like age and socioeconomic status, and these dark triad traits. And for men, we found that those who were high in psychopathy had fewer children, and those who were high in narcissism had more children. And for women, also being high in psychopathy was related to fewer children. Now, of course, we're looking at this, as we say, from an evolutionary point of view, but in a modern population that has access to healthcare and contraception. So, of course, we need to look at this in other groups. But there could be a range of reasons that psychopathy doesn't result in having a higher number of offspring. It could be, for example, that the preference for more risky short-term relationships results in poorer sexual health. And it could be, of course, that because people are more interested on a relative term in short-term relationships, they're spending more time securing new partners than perhaps related sexual behavior with an existing partner, which is more likely to result in having offspring. And we didn't find a relationship for the other traits. So it's certainly an area that needs additional research. Another area that we have been quite interested in more recent years is not just having a look at the relationship between dark triad traits and willingness to engage in some of this aggressive or hostile sexual behavior, but also how the dark triad traits relate to perceptions of that behavior. So, for example, we've been looking at things like sexual harassment. And of course, whilst it is important to understand why people engage in harassment, what kind of factors encourage that behavior, we also want to understand what the bystanders think and what prompts somebody or what makes somebody more likely to try to intervene either during that particular event or perhaps afterwards to support the person who's had that negative experience. So in terms of existing research, we know that those who are high in dark triad traits are more likely to show a range of aggressive sexual behaviors. And this is both men and women who are high in these dark triad traits. And these include things like sexual harassment and sexual coercion. And it seems that narcissism and primary psychopathy are particularly closely associated with these forms of aggressive behavior. And of course, this might be for a number of different reasons. It might be, for example, because they are less upset by the distress shown by a victim, because those high on dark triad traits are less likely to show an empathy towards victims, and they're more likely to kind of morally disengage or to seek pleasure from somebody else's distress. And in one, I think, really interesting study, the researchers looked here at how those high in dark triad traits might perceive other people who are more or less vulnerable. So they wanted to essentially see, okay, are people high on dark triad traits reacting to potential victims in different ways? So the researchers here presented the participants with video clips, and these clips were either people who were highly assertive and therefore perhaps moving more confidently and maybe seen as less vulnerable, or those who were low on that assertiveness scale and perhaps looked more likely to be at risk. And they found that the dark triad traits did not predict accuracy when it comes to picking out individuals who are more or less assertive or vulnerable, but that individuals who are high on these dark triad traits do tend to look at individuals, regardless of their own behavior, and see them as weak or vulnerable. So they're more likely to see other individuals as weak and as vulnerable, and therefore potential targets for victimization. So we've been looking at particularly at sexual harassment, which is certainly an issue which has been in the media a lot recently, but it also tends to be particularly prominent in certain contexts, such as university campuses. And there are certainly things that we can do to encourage not just perpetration rates to be lower, but also for other people to be active bystanders and to support the victim by intervening when appropriate or offering support. So to give you the background context, we're talking about behaviour which is both inappropriate and unwanted, but there's a huge range of behaviours that could be classed as sexual harassment, from touching to inappropriate comments, right through to sexual assault. And we certainly know that this kind of behaviour is often underreported. For a range of reasons. People might feel embarrassed, they might feel that they're not going to be believed, and what often happens is that rather than the first port of call being the authorities like the police, somebody who has experienced sexual harassment will talk to somebody else first, and they will explain, this is what happened to me. And then seek their guidance, seek their feedback. And if that person, of course, is sympathetic and understanding, then they would be more likely to seek support and recognise that they were not at fault and that this is a form of harassment. So we wanted to look at this other person, what are the perceptions that other people might have about sexual harassment, because of course that would feed into whether victims are more or less likely to report and seek guidance and support. So here we were looking at the Dark Triad traits, obviously, and perceptions of harassment. And we looked both at aspects of blame and also at aspects of, if you like, appropriate responses to the sexual harassment. So we looked at things like victim blame. So, people saying, okay, this was a scenario with a student and a professor who was sexually harassing them. And they were saying, okay, we're blaming the victim because the student was using it to their advantage. Or perpetrator blame would be that the professor is using their status inappropriately. So we looked at the victim blame, blaming the perpetrator, and also no blame. And then also what the response to this harassment would be. Would it be just comply with the harassment? Would it be to confront the harasser, or would it be to ignore that kind of behaviour? And so essentially, we found that women who were high on primary psychopathy, and this was the most important of the Dark Triad traits for this kind of perception, were more likely to blame the victim for the harassment, and they were less likely to blame the perpetrator. And women who were high on primary psychopathy were also more likely to suggest that victims should comply with this kind of sexual harassment, and less likely to suggest that they should confront the perpetrator. So clearly the Dark Triad traits held by this individual are influencing how they view harassment generally, and also what they think is an appropriate response to that. So this is really a flavour of some of the research that has been conducted in the area, but it shows you how some of these individual differences relating to Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy predict our attractiveness, our sexual behaviour, but also our perceptions of others' behaviour. And really, there's a lot more that needs to be researched in this area. But hopefully, I've convinced you a little bit that this is something that we should be as equally interested in females as men, but also in terms of long-term relationships rather than just these sort of short-term casual sex relationships. So thank you very much for listening, and I would be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Gayle. That was great. We've had a couple of questions come in. So one was thinking about COVID. Has there been any research done about how that may have contributed to making things worse? Obviously, if people are in a controlling relationship and they're sort of stuck indoors, then there's kind of no escape.
Yes, so there's been two separate elements of that, I suppose. There's been certainly research which has looked at the dark triad traits and COVID in terms of other kinds of behaviour, like hoarding behaviour and willingness to socially distance. But from a COVID and partner violence perspective, there's certainly been research that has been conducted there. Again, I've conducted some research with Minna Lyons and Luna Centofanti, looking at people's experiences of partner violence. And unfortunately, the partner violence has escalated. And there are a number of different aspects to this. You have, for example, and the paper's out, it's published now if you do want to have a look at it. But of course, you have people that are now being forced to work from home, whereas perhaps they would normally be going into the office, and then they have a break from that kind of behaviour. And now there's even greater opportunities for their controlling partner to monitor them. So if somebody is in the same house, they now have access to everything I do on the computer, rather than me having a separate PC and phone, etc., in the office. There's also fewer, or people have certainly perceived fewer opportunities to leave. So women reporting, because it was tended to be women that were the victims, but we weren't ruling out male victims in that study, were reporting that, they wanted to leave, or they even had plans to leave, but then the refuges were full, or other issues such as because alcohol consumption had increased, and because redundancies had increased and financial stressors were more prevalent, then that had exacerbated the partner violence and the controlling behaviour that they'd experienced. So there were lots of factors influencing that, but generally we've certainly seen that people were reporting more partner violence, unfortunately, during lockdown. We didn't have anybody saying that it had decreased. We did have some people saying that they were using the lockdown period to sort of reassess and to put certain things in place so that they could leave that partner. So for example, getting their bank details and identification, etc. Or if they were in a country where they were receiving a stimulus check during COVID, then they could use that as a deposit for accommodation. Because that was often a key, those sorts of practical issues were often key, because whilst in a normal world, you might think I can leave my partner and I can go and stay with relatives. If you're now worried about passing on this virus to somebody who is maybe shielding or elderly, then that's an issue as well. So yes, there's certainly been research which has looked at COVID and partner violence, and I think we need a lot more instruction provided in terms of how people can protect themselves during COVID, and kind of like practical sort of suggestions.
Thank you. That was very interesting. I assumed it was ongoing because I know it was a sort of concern. Parliamentarians and everyone was bringing it up at the beginning as something people were worried about. Question from Greg Lewin. Is it clear whether gender displays higher rates of dark triad traits? I have wondered if women have rates just as high as men, but exhibit it differently or are noticed less.
Yeah, interesting point. So I would say that the evidence is mixed here. Certainly there's a lot of research which has suggested that men exhibit higher levels of these dark triad traits than women, but there's also other studies that show that women have higher traits, or that there's no difference, and often we will look at whether the dark triad traits are impacting on men and women's behaviour similarly, or whether there's kind of a different consequence there. As you've pointed out, I mean, one of the problems, of course, is that we're using the same questionnaires and the same kinds of measures to look at these dark triad traits in both men and women. And it might be that you have these manifesting slightly differently in men and women. And I think that's something that really needs to be looked at in more detail.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of research into autism, because I used to work with autistic adults, and that was sort of held back by ideas of misogyny and patriarchy, and there wasn't as much research done into women, but we think there should be no reason that there's a gender disparity, but it doesn't get diagnosed as easily. So I guess that would account for this as well. It also made me think, with that background, was that taken into account, neurodiversity in the research? Because obviously they might people who are on the spectrum display things like empathy differently. So would that maybe confuse results, or?
So we haven't specifically looked at a neurodivergent population. There's been a lack of research, I'd say, in that kind of area in relation to the Dark Triad and those sorts of personality traits. I think that certainly if you're going to be looking at things like empathy, then that would be really useful to include. But it is important to emphasize that when we're looking at these traits, we are looking at them as personality traits in the general population, rather than as a personality disorder, for example, which people can often assume is the focus.
Also made me wonder, like, is this on a spectrum? Do people display some of these traits some of the time? Is it something that changes over people's age? Like, are younger men more likely to display these traits, and as they get older they sort of mellow? Or
yeah, the traits seem to be relatively stable, but you would expect somebody who is particularly risky, engage in risky behavior and sensation seeking, you would expect that to influence their behavior across different contexts. So it might, for example, influence the kinds of relationships they enter, but also the kinds of foods that they eat and their approaches to preventative medical care, etc. So I would say that it does tend to impact across a range of contexts, but the vast majority of the research, tends to be more focused on things like relationships or more cooperative and pro-social type behaviours or hostile behaviour.
A question from Sean about the evolutionary impact. A question about the evolutionary impact that would require these traits to be inherited. Is there evidence for that? Also, traits that produce more children isn't necessarily beneficial. Surely humans also need to raise and nurture those children to adults. Would these traits have an impact on that nurturing behaviour?
Yeah, so interestingly, just to take your second point first, there's been, I would say, a lack of research looking at how these Dark Triad traits predict people's parenting behaviour. So people are more likely to look at predictors of the Dark Triad traits in terms of things like heritability, the environmental factors, and the consensus generally is that psychopathy is more likely or has a higher heritability factor, but you would certainly expect there to be both a heritable component but also an environmental influence. So if you take something like Machiavellianism, for example, those individuals who are generally feeling as if others are going to exploit them and they have a lack of faith in others and a cynicism, that seems like something that would be heavily influenced by environmental factors and the kinds of relationships you're exposed to at a younger age. We have done some research. It's in the with the reviewers. So I was going to say the lap of the gods, but kind of the same thing. Looking at people's experience of parents who are high in the Dark Triad traits. Now, we obviously haven't in those studies been able to take the traits of the parents. We're asking adults, or the adults have given information about the parent, in this case, identifying them as somebody who is highly narcissistic. And then we're looking at their experiences of that parenting. So, for example, parents who are more likely to keep the child dependent on them, even into adulthood, so they have that sense of superiority and control, perhaps, and the way that certainly for a number of people, they were reporting that these parents were wanting them to be the only person in the child's life, so they were competing with any future romantic partners. So I would like to see a lot more research on how the Dark Triad influences parenting strategies, rather than just kind of other aspects of relationships.
Yes. It seems like there seems to be so much that you could research on this topic.
Absolutely. It's one of those frustrating things that you want to look at lots of different areas and just don't quite have all the time that you want.
A question from one of our audience, John Minton. Given the distinction between primary and secondary psychopathy as predictors, is the Dark Triad better thought of as a quartet?
Personally, I tend to prefer, when I've been doing Dark Triad research, to separate out the primary and secondary aspect. I do think they are quite distinct areas. On a practical level, often research has used sort of shorter questionnaires. So rather than having 60 questions to try and look at all those different 4 factors, they've been able to use less than 20 to look at the Dark Triad. So that's my personal preference, that I would say it's, if possible, to try and look at both the primary and secondary psychopathy. It's less likely to happen with other of the Dark Triad traits. So, for example, Machiavellianism, it's been proposed that there are different facets of that, but there seems to be a lack of consensus. So when people have done factor analyses on the Machiavellianism scales, some have found 3 factors, some 4, some 5. So there's not a lot of consensus there. More recently, some people have proposed a dark tetrad, but that's the narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, including sadism as well. So some people have used those, but I've not been focused on the dark tetrad myself.
One question I had was, how does media reinforce these controlling behaviours? Because some things that are thought of as controlling behaviours are portrayed as like quite romantic in film and TV. And
yeah, I think that we have been, as a society, quite slow to recognise the role of controlling behaviours and what controlling behaviours are. And I'm not saying that every form of romance is bad, that, I'm sure somebody will misinterpret this. But, if somebody is, for example, always coming to your place of work to pick you up, or sending flowers and things to that place of work, are they doing it to check that that's where you are and to sort of do a public signal that they are with you? Or is that a romantic gesture? And we need to encourage people to maybe reflect a little bit more, and look at some of the more subtle kinds of controlling behaviours, where people start to distance somebody from their friends and family, or where they comment on what they're wearing, which is not a helpful suggestion. And somebody being romantic and looking after you, it's not somebody sweeping in and doing these big gestures. Are they taking that autonomy away from you? So I think that the media has not helped in many respects, in the way that we sometimes look at these big romantic gestures, and the fact that we are perhaps supposed to meet somebody on a weekend, and then 10 days later we run off and get married to them because it's destined in the stars. I think a more honest discussion of romance and sexual relationships would be helpful, particularly in terms of some of those more subtle behaviours that we don't think to look out for.
Well, one thing that occurred to me was when you were talking about like checking people's phones and stuff, that is such a trope in TV. Always, you check your partner's phone and stuff like that, and it just sort of normalizes the element of control in a relationship, and it just, bad.
Yeah.
Bad
and I think there's a lot of technology, and again, I'm not saying that technology is inherently good or bad, but that it has a potential for misuse. So I'm perfectly happy with my friend, for example, having a tracker on my phone to check I got home okay, and those sorts of things. but it wouldn't be okay for a romantic partner to do that without my knowledge, to find out where I am. Or like, some of the doorbells now that have the videos on. So it's not intended for that use, but people can now see if their partner has left the house or not. So there's certainly a lot of innovation that can be misused now to control behaviour and to monitor people.
And so for our last question, which made me laugh when I read it, and you were talking about something quite dark, so my voice might have been bad, so I hope Mark hadn't cut to me at that point. But from Greg Lewin, where does our Prime Minister lie within the Dark Triad? Not asking who's in it, just where is he?
It's an interesting question. I'm a member of the British Psychological Society, and it is our custom not to comment on people that we have not met and do not have that information on. So it would be inappropriate for me to categorize an individual like that as high or low on dark triad traits. I will say that I am, how can I put this politely, not in support of the policies that have been proposed during that tenure. And I would strongly support anybody moving against that.
I guess the question I was thinking about his tendency to lie and being on his third wife and having 6 children, 7, who knows? He does.
Certainly, I mean, it's an interesting point, and people have debated this in relation to people like Donald Trump, that, as I say, we have historically not commented as a profession on individuals that we have not met, because it is not appropriate when we don't have that data, and we certainly wouldn't in a public domain to want to be trying to label somebody inappropriately. Others have argued that now, in a very different form of society, we have a lot more information about those individuals. So we have biographies, we have their tweets, we have, the speeches that they have, even if they've not completely written them, but they have delivered them, and the decisions that they have made, etc. So others have argued that we could use some of those patterns of behavior as kind of indicators of these sorts of personality traits.
Yeah, I've been following Bandy Lee over in America over the last few years with this whole Trump thing, because she was like opposing the Goldwater rule, as I think they call it over there, where you're not meant to do this because of Barry Goldwater, who was a bit of a Nazi. So we've just had one last question come in from someone who terms themselves Boghole. Surely the fact that most human societies arrive at hierarchical structures through violence and control of others, e.g. British aristocracy, implies some reproductive and thus evolutionary advantage.
Well, I mean, part of the issue is that you need to, we're looking at this on an individual level, and how an individual's dark triad traits might be associated with their relationships and their sexual behavior, etc. But you're right that it is important to think about this on a societal level, on a community level, because you need to look at the frequencies of these sorts of individuals in a population. Clearly, a society could not work if everybody is going to be cheating everybody else. But if you have a population who is largely trusting, largely works in a cooperative sense, because that's more productive for that society, but then a minority of individuals are able to be deceptive and are able to sort of cheat their way through that system, for example, by being high on psychopathy and not being concerned about the impact that they have on others, then those are more likely to kind of secure that advantage without having to put in that cooperative legwork that the rest of us normally have to do. So yes, you need to take that kind of broader societal look at the relative advantages in the whole population rather than just on an individual level.
Well, thank you very much. It's been fascinating, especially the Q&A. It's been a good chance to talk these things through in more detail. Just want to remind everyone to check out the events on the Science Festival programme. Their website has details of everything that they've got running. I think it runs till the end of the weekend. And don't forget to join us on Thursday for our next talk. I'll be here to introduce it and say hello to you then. So thank you very much.
Thank you.